I was first an activist for democracy and for human rights on a very broad perspective because I was part of a generation that lived through authoritarian military governments. I am from Brazil, but the South Cone of the Americas went through military coup d'etat in similar periods. And we have experienced then the loss of civil liberties, the state violation of human rights in what we can call the plum years. And at the same time, while this was happening in Brazil, then it was happening in Argentina, it was happening in Chile. But I'm also part of a generation that lived in Chile the dream, the utopian dream of Salvador Allende's election and the dream of a socialist government. So I think that I've always understood that life is much more than daily life or daily needs. Life transcends and has necessarily a broader, larger political project. And so I was very much active both in Chile and in Brazil, struggling for democracy and human rights. But at the same time, I studied at the Catholic University at the Department of Sociology. I made a research on the situation of the labor force and the women in the labor force. And when I did that, and the results and the statistics was like if I was coming across a new continent. I was making a discovery, which was, oh, wow, women, they earn less than men. They are the largest group in the non-paid category in the labor force. They do not occupy any really hierarchical high position in labor force. For equal education, they don't get equal pay. What's happening there? And then it was through this study that I said we have to struggle for democracy, but we also have to qualify democracy. I mean, democracy is not only voting or the political institutions in place, but it's also equality. And here in Brazilian society, we have clearly an unequal situation in relation to women. And at that time, it was the mid 70s. I started to search for other women who had similar preoccupations, and I found a group, and we started there what we would call a collective group, a feminist collective called Grupo Seres. And we started then to uh, place ourselves as feminists because what we wanted was democracy for all, but equality also for all. And it was so a pioneer movement in Brazil at that time. Feminism was already an important movement in Europe. In the US, you also had the presence of feminists along with civil rights movements. But in Brazil, we were quite the pioneers in starting this new wave of feminist movement and going public, demanding equality for women, not only in the labor market, but in education, in civil law, in political participation. And we also had in our agenda the struggle against violence against women, for reproductive rights. So it was really a very important moment in my life when I felt that I was starting a new path. And this is the path I'm still walking today after so many years, decades, I would say, because it's an endless work. Of course, the work is different, and in being active for women's rights, I have also walked different scales of power. I have been on a cabinet position for 4 years heading what is called the National Council for Women's Rights, which was an institution created by women's demand uh, with the democratization of the country. So the first civilian president, when democracy was restored, approved the creation by the Congress of this National Council for Women's Rights. And being there for 4 years were maybe key years of my life, because these were the years where a new constitution was being written in the country. And this constitution has the matrix of human rights. It is structured around human rights. And we women have organized a advocacy work that is recognized as one of the most important ones in Latin America, which was to assure women's rights in the Constitution. We developed a campaign, a constitution to be worth has to have women's rights. And this was a huge campaign done on a huge country. Brazil is a continental country. There were no internet at the time, maybe fax machines that were slow, telegrams, but we managed to really connect women from the Amazon to the South and ask them to send to the National Council their proposals for equality and equity for women in the new constitution. We connected by telegram, fax, telephone. That's the way people connected. And we had then thousands of letters and faxes, telegrams coming. We separated what was, well, let's say there were absurd things, but we worked with the demands that were plausible and feasible. And then we organized a group of lawyers that did extraordinary pro bono work for us in writing these demands in constitutional proposals. And we also worked with the Congress. We had them around 26 women, which is a small number for a Congress. But anyway, we managed to, independently of their political parties, to have them agree on most or all of our demands, and so had an immediate support in Parliament. But we also did a daily work with the Congress, a lobby, which is called by some known in Brazil as the lobby do batom, the lipstick lobby, where we would visit every day the leaders of the different parties and all the more important parliamentarians in terms of influence, and talk to them and explain to them why we were asking this, why it was important. As a result, besides taking this huge campaign to all the states of the country and being strongly connected with the women's movement that would then press the representatives of their states, we were able to assure more than 80% of women's demands in the new constitution. So I would say that the 1988 constitution is a landmark in women's rights, because their equality is affirmed in family law, in the labor market. Even the 1988 constitution was a little bit advanced in relation to the Vienna Human Rights Conference of 1993, because in the Brazilian constitution, we were able to have a proposal saying that the state had the duty to impede domestic violence. So that was really a big step, because you know that traditionally the human rights discourse and grammar is between state and individuals, and not between what happened between private individuals within the walls of a home. So there was a paradigmatic shift that in the Vienna 1993 conference will be affirmed with the slogan "Women's Rights are Human Rights" and domestic violence is a human rights violation. That was not seen as such. But then this constitution marked the moment where equality between men and women was really inscribed in our Magna Carta. But there is a distance between what is written in a legislation and what is in the hearts and minds of the population, what is implemented by private and governmental policies and institutions. And the big challenge, and that's why we keep working, is to diminish this distance, diminish this gap. We do have, after we had in the 90s and years 2000, changes in what we call ordinary law, penal code, family code, in order to equalize and get rid of the discriminations that were still present in these codes. But there's still a long way, because there is no progress without resistance. No progress without resistance. And also, there's not such a thing as a linear path towards progress when you're talking about rights and politics. What we see now is a regrouping of the extreme right, religion being a political factor. I mean, we have now political religion that really is very much anti-women's rights, particularly in relation to reproductive rights and sexual rights. And I think we are always seeing this backlash in relation to family, all that we had advanced in recognizing different forms of family. It's being questioned. In Brazil now, the current president of the Congress is an evangelical religious man that said that abortion would not be discussed unless it was over his dead body. So this degree of opposition is taking place in my country, and we are seeing the possibility of backlashes, constitutional revisions. But anyway, what I would say is that from the beginning of my activism in the 70s until today, there has been a long way that we also have to celebrate, because a lot has been gained and improved. Also, a lot has been accomplished in the world. Actually, I would say that the 20th century is the century of human rights. From the Universal Declaration in the 40s until the Women's Beijing Conference, and after that, in the year 2001, the Conference Against Racism and Xenophobia. We have advanced and we have changed the human rights language, because first human rights, they were built basically rooted on political rights, and then we had the social rights, because without social equality you just have a discourse, but it's disconnected to reality. And then we started, and this I say that women have been key protagonists along with other civil society groups. Then we start a moment where civil society as a political actor really starts to interfere. And we start then to distinguish within the human rights realm individuals and dimensions of life. So you have CEDAW, directed specifically to women. You have the Convention on the children's rights, but you also bring new dimensions of life, such as environment, such as violence and violence against women, such as health, reproductive rights, into the human rights world. And then you draw specific conventions, treaties. I give you a few examples. In our part of the world, we had in 1994 the Convention on the Elimination of Violence, Elimination and Prevention of Violence Against Women, which is a very important inter-American convention called Belém do Pará. And this convention is very important, and it will, in a certain sense, give legitimacy to other laws, national laws, for instance, all the national laws on violence against women in different countries of the Americas that come after the convention, including in Brazil, the Maria da Penha law, which is a very important law on violence against women, in which CEPIA, my organization, was deeply involved and is deeply involved in its implementation. This is a legislation from 2006. Also, from health, that became a right and then entered this dimension to reproductive health and reproductive rights. We've had the UN conferences, as I mentioned before, the Vienna conference, but first was the Rio conference on environment, then the Vienna conference on human rights, and then the Cairo conference on population and development. In all these thematic conferences, women have had a key role in enlarging the meaning of human rights and bringing these dimensions that are key to women's lives into the human rights language. And what we see, however, is a tension between human rights and social and economic rights. A tension that shouldn't be there because rights are universal and are indivisible. And what we have now been witnessing in the world is that while progress is being made and poverty has been reduced in many parts of the world, the disparity within countries and between countries, between richness and poverty, is increasing. There is a French economist, Thomas Piketty. He has just published a very interesting book showing that the returns of the financial capital are much higher than the returns of investment in productivity or in employment, and that this discrepancy is increasing and making the distance between the rich and the poor grow with the development of capitalism. And that's not by accident, it's in the logic of capital. And unless measures are not taken by the state, this tendency will go on and on. So when I think about development, and this is also part of the human rights agenda, the right to development, it's very important to qualify development. For a long time, development was synonymous to economic growth, GDP growth, net income raise, and seen and measured by numbers and only numbers. But development has to do with people, has to do with men, women, children, with young and old people, with people living in urban or in rural zones. And when you start to bring people to the center of development, we have, the world, the UN has made a step forward by introducing the concept of human development centered in the human being. And what is very interesting in this concept of human developed is that it's rooted in 3 dimensions, which are education, access to education, number of years in education, health, and health very much centered on longevity, and of course income, because we cannot take away income from development. And in the root also of this new perspective on development is the idea of choice. It's the idea that human beings should be able to make choices. And in order to make choices, first they have to live, and live long enough to make choices in different moments of their lives, thus the dimension of health and longevity. Also, they have to have access to education, because education is key to information and knowledge, which are the basis for informed decisions and choices. And they have to have the right to access to income, enough to have water, enough to have a shelter, enough to have food, which are also fundamental things to survival. And that then, if you have this guarantee, it will allow you to also use your income to make choices in other aspects of your life. I think this idea of choice, of freedom, it's so important for any human being at any moment of our life. A child makes choice. An old person makes choice. But on the other hand, if you start to bring the gender dimension to this equation, you will see that being a woman is really, really a handicap to make choices. Because in many parts of the world, women have less access to education than men. And it's not only an issue of access to education. There is significant progress in assuring access to education, including in my country, in Brazil. Apparently 98% of children are enrolled in schools. It's not so much access. In some parts of the world, it's still a question of access. But it's also the universe of choices that is put in front of you. And this is very unequal still between men and women. Women are oriented to certain careers, men to others. And then with a very clear gender perspective. If you go to the other dimension, which is health, well, you see clearly that in many countries, it's the health of the man, because he is the most valuable in terms of the hierarchies that are present in a given society, that will be given more attention than the health of the women. It is a scandal, for instance, the rate of mortality, maternal mortality, still in so many countries. This is because women is less valuable in that society, because maternal mortality, the decrease in the rate of maternal mortality does not depend on really high and very complex technology. It just depends on political will. And yet women still die of maternal mortality in rates that are incompatible with human development. And this is clearly a gender issue. And finally, if we take the last part of the equation, which is income, everywhere, in every part of the world, everywhere, women, for the same work and with the same level of education, earns less than men. In some countries, they earn 70% less than men. In others, like Brazil, they earn 30% less than men, but they always earn less than men. So we see that human development is a key concept to deal with poverty, with, you know, human rights, possibility to grow and to realize um, dreams. It's key to quality of life, but has to be understood from a gender perspective. Otherwise, we tend to miss this issue of cultural and also legal and sometimes institutional barriers that women face in different parts of the world, and that are key then to understand why she has less choices than men. Being part of a women's learning partnership, for me, it's coming to a beautiful new family. Basically, the feeling I have is that I belong to a group of women from very different cultural backgrounds, from different parts of the world, that can work together, and not only can work together, but are working together. And I really think that Women's Learning Partnership is making a difference. It is not easy to make a difference in such a complex, difficult, hard world as today. For my organization, being a partner, it has been very important because we have been able to multiply in Brazil this methodology that is participatory and that allows for many different women to discover how they are able to change the world. So it's like a chain. You feel that you are part of a family that grows. It's always growing.